Racist cop arrests black man for no reason. But when he finds out who he is, everything changes. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. It was a busy Monday morning when Justice Marcus Allen, dressed in casual clothes, walked down the sidewalk. No one would have known he was a Supreme Court judge just by looking at him. He had his briefcase in one hand, a cup of coffee in the other, heading towards his car. The city was alive, bustling with the usual sounds of honking horns and hurried footsteps. But today would be different, and Marcus had no idea. Out of nowhere, a police officer, Officer Collins, stepped in front of him. "Hold on there," he said, his tone sharp and demanding. Marcus stopped in his tracks. The officer's stance was aggressive, his eyes scanning Marcus from head to toe. "Where do you think you're going?" Collins asked, his voice dripping with suspicion. Marcus looked at him, confused. "Excuse me? I'm just heading to my car." Officer Collins narrowed his eyes. "I don't know you. You don't belong here. Show me your ID." Marcus, slightly annoyed but still calm, reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his driver's license. "Here," he said, handing it over. The officer glanced at it, then back at Marcus, a smug smile creeping onto his face. "I don't think you're supposed to be here," Collins said, ignoring the ID completely. "You look suspicious. Let's see what you're really up to." Marcus, now starting to feel uncomfortable, stood his ground. "I'm just a man trying to get to work. I haven't done anything wrong." But Officer Collins wasn't listening. "Don't play games with me. You're probably up to no good." He stepped closer, his hand reaching for Marcus's arm. "Get in the car." The words hit Marcus like a slap in the face. "What?" he said, incredulous. "Are you serious?" Before Marcus could respond, Officer Collins was pulling him by the arm, forcing him toward the squad car. "You're coming with me, whether you like it or not." The tension was palpable. The small crowd that had gathered on the sidewalk started whispering, some reaching for their phones, sensing that something wasn't right. The officer didn't care. His judgment had already been made. Marcus was now in the back of the squad car, his hands cuffed tightly behind him. The officer slammed the door shut, getting into the driver's seat. As the car began to roll forward, the officer started muttering under his breath. "You think you're something special, huh? Just because you walk around in fancy suits and act like you own the place? You're no different from the rest of them. You don't belong here." Marcus sat in silence, trying to process what was happening. He couldn't understand why the officer was treating him this way. The officer's words stung, but Marcus remained calm. He knew this wasn't the time for a fight. This was the time for patience. But then, as the officer continued to insult him, something clicked in Marcus's mind. He knew this wasn't about him personally. It was about racism. The officer had already made up his mind before he even spoke to Marcus. To him, Marcus was just another black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. "Do you know who I am?" Marcus asked quietly, his voice steady despite the rage bubbling inside him. The officer, clearly annoyed, scoffed. "Yeah, I know. You're just some guy, probably thinking you can get away with anything." He glanced over his shoulder. "You're nobody." The words stung, but Marcus held his ground. "You really don't know who I am, do you?" As the squad car rolled down the streets, the sounds of the city faded into the background. Marcus sat silently in the back, his wrists still shackled, but his mind was racing. He knew this moment could turn ugly, and despite his calm exterior, inside he was furious. The officer, Officer Collins, was oblivious to the weight of the situation. His arrogance was now on full display as he continued to bark insults at Marcus from the front seat. "Let's be clear," Collins said, glancing into the rearview mirror. "People like you think you can walk around like you're somebody important. But not today. Not on my watch." Marcus clenched his jaw. He had been in far worse situations in his life, but this was different. This wasn't just some random encounter. This was personal. It wasn't about a misunderstanding or a misplaced assumption. This was a direct manifestation of racial prejudice, a belief that someone like Marcus, a black man, didn't have the right to exist freely in certain spaces, let alone be respected. The officer's words continued to sting. You should be grateful I'm not taking you straight to jail right now. Just lucky I'm not in a worse mood." Marcus exhaled deeply. His thoughts drifted, his mind calculating the best course of action. The situation was escalating quickly, but he had to remain level-headed. He was too experienced to lose his cool in moments like these. The car hit a red light, and Collins pulled over to the side of the road. He took a deep breath, and for a moment, Marcus wondered if the officer might just leave him in peace. But instead, Collins turned around in his seat, looking Marcus over once again with a scowl. "I'm guessing you don't even know what's coming for you," the officer sneered, leaning in. "This is the kind of stuff that lands people in serious trouble." Marcus could feel the tension rising, but he held his ground. "You really don't get it, do you?" he asked quietly. Collins, not getting the hint, shrugged. "What's there to get? You're just another guy who thinks they're above the law. Look at you. You probably have a criminal record." Marcus let out a small laugh, but there was no humor in it. "I have no criminal record," he said flatly. "But you might want to look me up." The officer turned his gaze back to the road, his smirk still in place. "You think that's going to scare me? You're wasting your time, pal. This is the way things are around here." But the truth was, Marcus wasn't the one wasting his time. Officer Collins was about to learn just how wrong he was, and it was going to be a lesson he'd never forget. The next few minutes felt like hours. The officer's voice droned on, but Marcus barely heard him anymore. He was lost in his thoughts, reflecting on his journey to this moment. The road to becoming a Supreme Court judge had never been easy. There had been countless obstacles, prejudices, and fights along the way, but he had risen above them all, always focused on justice. Marcus had worked tirelessly for years to get to where he was, and he wasn't about to let some ignorant officer ruin it. Finally, the car slowed as they pulled into the station. Collins turned to look at Marcus again, his smugness unwavering. "All right, let's see what happens next," he said, unlocking the door and getting out of the car. As Marcus stepped out, the officer handcuffed him tightly to the bench in the interrogation room. But there was a shift in the air. Collins wasn't saying anything now. Instead, he was just staring at his computer screen, running Marcus's name through the system. Minutes passed in complete silence. Finally, the officer looked up, his eyes wide in disbelief. His face went pale, and he stammered, "Wait a minute. Marcus Allen, the Supreme Court judge?" Marcus leaned back in his seat, unbothered. "Yes," he said simply. "I am." The officer's smugness melted away, replaced by panic. I didn't know. I didn't mean to. Marcus didn't let him finish. "You didn't mean to do what? Assume that I didn't belong here? That I was just another criminal? You didn't mean to humiliate me for no reason?" The officer was frozen. His earlier bravado had disappeared, and now it was Marcus's turn to control the room. The interrogation room was cold. The only sound was the soft hum of the fluorescent lights above. Officer Collins stood frozen, staring at the computer screen, processing the information that was now staring him in the face. Marcus Allen, Supreme Court judge, one of the most respected figures in the legal world, sitting in the very same room he had just attempted to arrest without cause. For a few moments, neither spoke. The weight of the situation settled in, and Collins realized his entire world had just shifted. He wasn't facing an ordinary citizen. This wasn't some random man he had pulled over or a suspected criminal. He had arrested someone who could end his career with a single phone call. Marcus, however, didn't need to say a word. He already knew how this was going to play out. The officer was going to try to save face, to somehow justify his actions. But there was no coming back from this, not this time. The silence lingered until finally Collins stammered, I didn't know. I didn't mean to." Marcus raised a hand, cutting him off. "It's clear you didn't mean to, but you still did it. You assumed I was just another black man to be treated however you felt, without questioning it. You let your bias lead you, and now look where we are." Collins swallowed hard, his face red with embarrassment. He opened his mouth to apologize, but Marcus wasn't interested in his excuses. "I don't need your apology," Marcus said firmly. What I need is for you to understand the consequences of your actions, and not just for me, but for everyone who has ever been treated like this, for everyone who's had to face this kind of injustice simply because of the color of their skin." The officer's posture softened, and for the first time there was a genuine look of regret on his face. But it was too little, too late. The damage had already been done. "I'm sorry," Collins said, finally finding his voice. I shouldn't have assumed anything about you. I thought—" "You thought what?" Marcus cut him off, his voice calm but piercing. "That I wasn't capable of being successful? That I didn't belong in this part of town? That because I'm black, I must be doing something wrong? You didn't even take a second to think, did you?" Collins nodded, eyes lowered in shame. "I was wrong. You're right. I didn't think." Marcus let the silence stretch for a moment before speaking again. "It's not just about this incident. It's about how people like me have to live every day, constantly fighting against assumptions and stereotypes. You saw a black man and immediately decided I didn't have the right to walk these streets. You didn't know who I was, what I'd achieved, or the life I'd built. You just saw my skin color and made a judgment." The officer's face twisted with guilt, but Marcus could see it wasn't just about regret. It was scary now. Fear of the power Marcus held in this moment. Fear of the truth that he couldn't take back what he had done. Marcus stood up, straightening his jacket. "You've got two options now. One, you can apologize and go on with your day, hoping you learned something. Or two, you can keep fighting this, ignoring the reality of your actions. But trust me, Collins, I know how this ends." Collins's eyes flickered with panic as he realized the magnitude of what had happened. This wasn't just some random arrest. This wasn't just a bad decision on his part. This could cost him everything: his job, his reputation, and his future. I'll make this right," Collins muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus gave him a cold, piercing look. "You'll make it right when you take responsibility, when you understand that no one at all, should ever be treated like this. It's not just about me. It's about changing the way you see people like me, and the people who are watching this." The officer's shoulders slumped in defeat as Marcus turned and walked toward the door, his hand on the handle. He could feel the weight of the officer's gaze on his back, but he didn't turn around. Marcus Allen had already won. Not because he was a Supreme Court judge, not because he was special or more important than anyone else. He had won because he had refused to be silenced, refused to be underestimated. As he stepped out of the station, Marcus knew this would be a story told for years. A story of how one man's prejudice could turn into a learning experience. A story that would echo beyond the walls of the station, beyond the city streets, and hopefully one day change the course of history. But more than anything, Marcus hoped it would change the hearts of people like Officer Collins, who had made his judgment based on nothing more than skin color. And just maybe, that change would ripple through the entire police force. The following week, the headlines were all over the city. A viral video shot by a local bystander had exploded on social media. Marcus Allen's calm but powerful words to Officer Collins were now the talk of the town. What had started as a random arrest had turned into something much bigger, a reckoning for the police department, for the community, and for every person who had ever faced prejudice. But for Marcus, the attention wasn't the important part. The conversation it sparked was. As a Supreme Court judge, he had lived a life steeped in justice, but even he had never imagined the kind of momentum his story would build. The case wasn't just about one officer making a mistake. It was about the systemic problem that had been plaguing the justice system for decades. That Monday morning, Marcus woke up to another wave of media requests. Talk shows, newspapers, even online blogs, all asking for his take on the incident. But Marcus didn't want to be just another headline. He had bigger plans. At the breakfast table, his wife Karen watched him in silence. "Are you really going to do this?" she asked, her voice a mix of concern and pride. Marcus paused, looking at her across the table. "I have to. It's not just about what happened to me. It's about what's happening to countless others every day. This is a chance to force a change. Karen nodded slowly, understanding. She had seen the toll the world had taken on her husband, but she had also seen his unwavering commitment to justice. If anyone could make a difference, it was Marcus Allen. Later that day, Marcus stood before a group of local lawmakers, journalists, and community leaders. The room fell silent as he took his seat. This wasn't a courtroom. This wasn't a place for formalities or legal jargon. This was a town hall meeting, and it was time for a real conversation. "I know many of you are here because of the video," Marcus began, his voice steady and commanding. "But I'm not here to talk about Officer Collins. I'm here to talk about all of you. All of us. We all have a part to play in what happened last week, whether we realize it or not." There was a ripple of murmurs across the room. The conversation was beginning to take a turn. Marcus continued, "I've spent my career fighting for justice, but I can't do it alone. And I can't do it with just a court ruling. Change has to come from within each of us." One of the lawmakers, a young woman named Senator Michelle Graves, stood up. "What do you suggest we do? What's the first step?" Marcus took a deep breath. "We start with training. We start with understanding. The systems that are in place, the training that is being given to police officers, they need to change. We need to teach people not just how to enforce the law, but how to respect the humanity of the people they serve." The room was quiet again, everyone hanging on his every word. Marcus wasn't just speaking as a judge. He was speaking as a man who had lived through discrimination, as someone who had spent years fighting for justice. "We need a system where every individual is seen for who they are," he continued, his eyes scanning the room. "We need police officers to understand that they are not the judge, the jury, and the executioner. The law is there to protect everyone, regardless of race, background, or status." The conversation turned into a heated debate, with some people agreeing with Marcus and others pushing back. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that people were finally talking. The issue wasn't just being brushed under the rug anymore. It was being addressed head-on. As the meeting ended, Marcus received several calls for interviews and meetings. He could feel the momentum building, but he knew this was only the beginning. He had ignited a conversation, but now it was time to turn that conversation into action. Later that night, as he sat with his family, Marcus felt a sense of peace. The world was far from perfect, but for the first time in a long while, he felt that change was possible. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick, but the seeds of transformation had been planted, and that, he knew, was worth every moment. As weeks went by, the fallout from the incident continued to reverberate across the nation. Marcus Allen had never expected his story to catch fire the way it did, but now, everywhere he went, people recognized him, not just as a judge, but as a symbol of hope for change. The media had labeled it the turning point of the year, and for good reason. It wasn't every day that a Supreme Court judge, someone with decades of experience in the law, spoke out so boldly against an unjust system. But Marcus's message wasn't about him. It was about the future of justice. And slowly, people were beginning to listen. At the office, Marcus's colleagues were more supportive than ever. But the calls kept coming in. Phone lines buzzed with reporters from every outlet, eager for his opinion on the next big case or the next step in police reform. He was a man on a mission now, and his focus never wavered. He was no longer just fighting for justice in the courtroom. Now his fight was for real, lasting change. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Marcus sat with his wife Karen at their kitchen table talking about the road ahead. Karen had always supported him, but lately the weight of the pressure was starting to show. She could see the toll it was taking on him. "You've done more in a few weeks than most people do in a lifetime," she said softly, placing a cup of tea in front of him. "But you're only human, Marcus. You can't carry this burden alone." Marcus smiled at her, grateful for her unwavering support. "I know, but I've always believed in the power of people. If we can get enough of the right people on board, we can change everything, one step at a time." Karen nodded. "But remember, Change isn't always easy. You've made a lot of enemies with this stand, Marcus. Be careful. He understood her concern, but he couldn't back down now. There was too much at stake. And now, after everything that had happened, he wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for every person who had ever felt unjustly judged, every person who had ever been treated unfairly because of their skin color, their status, or their background. The ripple effects of Marcus's actions were being felt not just in local communities, but in the highest offices across the country. Several lawmakers began pushing for police reform bills, echoing the very principles Marcus had laid out in his town hall speech. His name was appearing more and more on national news, his words reaching a broader audience than he had ever imagined. But as Marcus rose to prominence, he also faced increasing scrutiny. Critics of his actions claimed that he was making a spectacle out of a simple police mistake, that he was politicizing the issue of race and justice. The backlash was expected, but it didn't faze him. Marcus had been through enough battles in his life to know that real change was never easy. If people weren't angry, he probably wasn't doing it right. The following month, Marcus was invited to speak at a national convention for civil rights leaders. The room was filled with some of the most influential figures in the country, and they all wanted to hear what he had to say. As he stood before the crowd, the weight of the moment hit him. He wasn't just speaking for his own community now, he was speaking for millions of people who had suffered in silence for far too long. "This is our moment," Marcus began, his voice steady and strong. "We are at a crossroads. This is not just about reforming a few laws or punishing a few bad officers. This is about changing the very foundation of how we see each other. It's about recognizing the humanity in everyone, regardless of their skin color or their job title. The system is broken, and it's up to us to fix it." The crowd erupted in applause, and for a moment, Marcus allowed himself to feel the power of the movement. This wasn't about him anymore. This was bigger than any individual. This was about changing the future. As the event came to a close, Marcus stood by the stage, reflecting on everything that had led him here. The police officer who had arrested him for no reason had no idea what he had started that day. He had tried to humiliate Marcus, but in the process, he had helped spark a revolution, and Marcus was determined to see it through to the end. The road ahead was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. Marcus Allen was no longer just a judge. He was a force for change, and nothing was going to stop him now. The case was finally over. The national outrage, the debates, the protests, everything had come to a head, and now it was time to put the past behind. But for Marcus Allen, the consequences of that fateful arrest would stay with him forever. Not just because of the injustice he had suffered, but because it had sparked something bigger than himself. As he walked out of the courtroom, the sunlight hit his face, but it wasn't just the warmth of the day that made him feel alive. It was the weight of the victory. The case was not only about his wrongful arrest anymore, it was about something far more important, a message that had spread across the country, inspiring thousands to challenge the status quo. But even after the dust had settled, Marcus knew the fight was far from over. Just because the case had been dismissed didn't mean that everything was fixed. It didn't mean that justice had been served, not fully. The system was still broken, and Marcus had only just begun to scratch the surface. The media attention, while intense at first, started to fade away. But Marcus was undeterred. His inbox was flooded with messages from people all over the country. Some thanked him for standing up for what was right. Others shared their own stories of mistreatment by the police or the justice system. It was clear to him that his battle had only begun. One day, as he sat in his office reviewing case files, he received a call that would change his perspective on everything. The voice on the other end was familiar, but unexpected. "Marcus," the voice said, "this is Congressman Matthews. I've been following your story, and I believe you're exactly what this country needs right now. We're working on a new initiative, one that focuses on police reform and systemic change. And we need someone with your courage, your insight." For a moment, Marcus was silent. He had always believed in justice, but this was an entirely different level. The fact that a high-ranking government official was calling him was overwhelming. He hadn't thought that his actions could lead to something on such a large scale. But it also felt like the natural next step. The world had seen him as a symbol of hope. Now it was time to make real change. Over the next few months, Marcus worked tirelessly with lawmakers, civil rights organizations, and legal experts. They crafted a comprehensive proposal that would address issues of police misconduct, racial profiling, and unequal treatment under the law. Marcus knew that this wouldn't be easy. He had seen the pushback from people who felt threatened by any form of change. But he was used to being the underdog. He was used to fighting battles that seemed impossible. He became a key speaker at rallies, advocating for a new era of justice. And slowly but surely, the momentum began to build. People from all walks of life, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, united under one common cause: to fix a system that had been failing so many for so long. It wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It was about a movement that had the potential to transform the very fabric of the country. Despite the growing support, there were still those who doubted the changes that were being proposed. They dismissed it as radical or unnecessary. But Marcus knew that change was never comfortable. It was never supposed to be easy. History had shown time and time again that the most important reforms had always faced the most resistance. But the tide was turning. A bill that Marcus had helped draft was now making its way through Congress. It was one of the most significant pieces of legislation in decades, one that would finally hold police accountable for their actions and protect the rights of those who had been marginalized for far too long. As Marcus stood before the Senate, watching as the bill was passed by an overwhelming majority, a sense of pride washed over him. He had done it. He had helped ignite a movement that would change the course of history. And while the work wasn't finished, this was a significant victory, one that would be remembered for generations. And yet, even as he celebrated, Marcus knew that there was always more work to be done. There would always be those who would fight for the status quo. There would always be challenges ahead. But now he had the power of the people behind him. And together they could face anything. The road ahead was uncertain, but Marcus Allen had made his mark on history. And for the first time in his life, he felt truly hopeful for the future. A future where justice, equality, and fairness weren't just ideals, but a way of life. Marcus Allen's journey didn't just change his life. It changed the lives of millions. It's proof that even the smallest spark can ignite a revolution. What's your story? Have you ever stood up for what's right, no matter the consequences? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like and share this video. Together, we can make a difference.